Pop Talking Aliens, the William Clear podcast.
We're going to be talking a lot about truth in this episode, a lot about what people say, what their own perception of truth is, what other people's perception of their truth is, etc., etc. So before we get to all of that conflicting truths and things that people have said that may or may not be true, let's establish that what she just said is absolutely true and unquestionable, unflappable truth. I am William Clear. This is Pop Talking Aliens, and it is a podcast. And this episode, we are going to talk Bob Lazar. We are going to talk Bob Lazar because I just saw a documentary that came out this year about Bob Lazar that stoked my passions for the subject of Area 51 and S4 and the back engineering of spacecraft and everything that Bob Lazar claimed was going on there. It stoked the flames to a madness, and I had to do a podcast episode about it. Before we get into all of it, though, I want to let you know that Pop Talking Aliens is brought to you by Audible. You can get a free trial of Audible, 30 days, and a free audiobook by going to this very special link just for me, just from the show, audibletrial.com/poptalkingaliens. Go to audibletrial.com/poptalkingaliens and you can download your choice of well over 100,000 books. Audiobooks that you can enjoy on your device, on your computer, wherever you like. I always say you can download them. I love that about it, so that you don't have to be online to listen to your audiobook. Just have it on your device, walk around, enjoy it, work out to it, and so forth. 30 days free. Get a book. Try it out. audibletrial.com/poptalkandaliens. Also, Patreon. Let's not forget the no Patreon account for Pop Talking Aliens. And it turns out, as of late, no Patreon account for a lot of people. A lot of people are jumping ship from that thing. Apparently they were banning people from using their service or something. I had no idea what the reason was. I assume it was politics. I don't know what their politics were, but I'm sure it was some sort of one of those things, right, where people were banned. Because all I know is I saw a bunch of people saying, why I no longer have Patreon account. I'm leaving Patreon. So, you know what? Good. I mean, I just can't imagine doing this podcast and telling you that if you pay me $1 a month or $5 a month, I will give you access to my special secret Star Wars podcast, or I'll do a question and answer session once a month and I give you a dumb Pop Talking Aliens t-shirt. I just like talking to you. And if you want to sign up for an Audible trial, that's great. If you really want to help the show, just give us a rating on iTunes. Give us a nice 5-star, fat 5-star rating. That is more than a Patreon account would ever do for us. Anyway, let's get into this Bob Lazar stuff, this new documentary, which has re-stoked the flames of my madness. So, my plan originally was going to be that I was going to talk about Roswell, do a big, huge, epic Roswell episode in January to start off our 4th year of this podcast. Yeah, 4th year. We're just coming up on 3 years, so we're going to start our 4th year, and that would have been the big celebration. And it will be. But I had to get an episode in between. An emergency podcast, almost, because of this Bob Lazar documentary. I watched it 3 times in 2 days. The documentary is called Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers, and it is available on Amazon. The downfall of it is that it is not available on Amazon Prime. So if you're a Prime member, you're shit out of luck, as I am. And you can't rent it from Amazon either. You got to pay like $15.99 and you got to buy it, and you're going to own it until the day you die. For me, money well spent money. I'm going to watch that thing fucking 5 more times at least in the next month. But unless you are super into that thing and you know this kind of stuff to the point of wanting to watch it more than once, it's a steep price. But if you do love the Bob Lazar story, it's such a good documentary in how it portrays what Bob Lazar was all about when he came out and, was a whistleblower about what was going on at Area 51, specifically S4, which is not exactly Area 51, but we'll talk about that. And then catching up with him today and what he does today, how he feels about everything he said, how he sticks to his story. And the movie is produced by George Knapp, who was the original reporter, Las Vegas television reporter that broke the Bob Lazar story. And George Knapp features prominently in this movie. So that's great because George Knapp knows everything Bob Lazar, knows Bob Lazar very well. And we get to see a lot of old clips of Lazar talking and then, contrasted with what he says today. It's fantastic. I'm going to get into a lot of it for you. The only thing that I guess you could say sucks about this documentary, or you could say it's fascinating, probably both, is that it is... The segments of the movie are interrupted maybe 7 or 8 times by the philosophical ramblings of Mickey Rourke. I kid you not. There'll be a segment of the movie that's totally up front, talking about Bob Lazar, interviewing him, showing him clips from the past. And then, before they go to the next segment, they'll break in with all these weird special effects, like bad special effects, and weird music, and Mickey Rourke just saying the most trippy, stream of consciousness, weird stuff that you can imagine about like the nature of consciousness and civilization and what are they hiding from us and how we don't recognize the most important moments of our lives and stuff. And it's like, it's so almost barely tangentially connected to what the subject matter of this documentary is. But I guess if you get Mickey Rourke and he says he wants to narrate it, there's no real narration that would be necessary for this movie. It is very linear in its structure, and it presents itself very well. So you don't need a narrator to say, and then Bob Lazar went to work for this. You don't need that. So I guess they still felt they needed quote unquote narration. So they just get Mickey Rourke doing stuff like, what the fuck are they trying to hide from us? Consciousness is but a shooting star in an apple tree, breaking down rocks from foreign places, skies unknown. It's basically that. I'll actually play you a clip of it because you must hear it to believe it.
Not to burst your bubble, but the Earth is not the center of the universe. At least not anymore. You are not the star of your own movie. Humans are not the top of the food chain. And fate is a fantasy. But I can't prove any of this, even if I wanted to.
But the movie, again, it came out in 2018. It is directed by a guy named, and this is only one guy, but his name is Jeremy Corbell. 4 names, 1 person. And again, produced by George Knapp. And the only people that are really in it are this Corbell guy, Bob Lazar, and George Knapp. And then like Bob Lazar's wife is in it, and his mom's briefly interviewed. But if you are not familiar with Bob Lazar to begin with, and everything I've said up to this point is Greek to you, then let me just give you some background on Bob Lazar and what he's all about. So in 1989, George Knapp, like I said, Las Vegas TV reporter, broke the story of this guy that he presented. He was in shadows, right? Being interviewed in the back of a van, came forward and said, and they show this in the documentary, I have been working on extraterrestrial craft at S4, which is somewhat connected to Area 51. There is alien technology. We have 9 ships. I've been working on one of them. I've seen 2 of them. They have dead aliens there. I have been briefed on the alien beings that are from the Zeta Reticuli system, as we have talked about before. Zeta Reticuli being the assumed home of the gray aliens. So according to Bob Lazar and his work at Area 51 S4, that is indeed the case. And we have fully operational craft from them. Now what happened was, after that interview in the van, I guess the people that, Bob Lazar's supervisors or whatever, knew that was him. Not exactly sure the sequence of events. It's never really been made clear, but he was definitely threatened. Apparently his back tire was shot out. And so he decided to just go full exposure. Not literally. It's not, like that kind of thing. But he exposed his face, his name, everything on camera with George Knapp, and just spilled his guts about everything. He talked about how the ships worked. He talked about everything that he saw at S4. He went into great detail. And they show a clip of this in the documentary. And they're asking Bob Lazar, well, why are you doing this now? Why are you, coming out full on saying I'm Robert Lazar. I worked on Spacecraft at S4. And he says there's kind of three reasons. The first is that he thinks it's a crime that we as a people be denied the knowledge of the fact that the government is well aware and in possession of artifacts from extraterrestrials. The second being that the fact that we have this technology that literally does not exist on Earth in our possession is a crime to the scientific community. And then the third thing he says, which is the most interesting because of the way he says it, is he says, I'm also trying to take out an insurance policy because if something happens to me, here I am on camera telling you what I know, telling you who I am. So if I show up chopped up in an oil barrel tomorrow, he doesn't say that, but you know what I'm saying, then, I was probably right. And I think that was a good idea because he has been harassed and vilified and humiliated through the course of his life, but he hasn't been killed. He's still alive. But the thing that interests me so much about that scene, and this is a clip in the documentary, but it's a clip from 1989, I think, or 1990 when he first came out. What fascinates me is this. I am not a body language expert. I am not a psychologist. I am not like a good method actor that can discern people's body language and the little signals that they give you. But I can tell you without a doubt that when Bob Lazar in this clip starts talking about how he's taking out an insurance policy and how he's sort of nervous about his own safety, you can clearly see the fear welling up within him. Like he starts swallowing more, like his neck becomes tense. He's like, he's like, he gets that thing. And the dude is clearly not, I mean, if you see a lot of clips through him through this movie and in the past, he's clearly not like a good actor. He's just this sort of nerdy scientist guy who explains stuff. When he talks about taking out an insurance policy so that if he gets killed, everyone knows that he's right, he is clearly afraid. Clearly afraid. There are many things, and we'll talk about some of them, that go with Bob Lazar that suggest very solidly that there's some truth to what he's saying. Maybe not everything he says and has said over the years is true, but there are truths within it. And one of them is actually proven in this documentary. So to speak to George Knapp, who, again, broke the story. George Knapp is not some fucking UFO crazed lunatic. He didn't, he was on the fence about even going with the story, but he thought it was interesting enough. He had talked to some other people. He had some suspicions about what was going on out there in the desert near Las Vegas off Highway 375. So he brought Bob Lazar on, and George Knapp is a man who has, count them, 27 Emmys. 27 Emmys. Regional Emmys, but Emmys nonetheless. They are fucking Emmys. He has, because he works in Las Vegas, but he has 27 goddamn Emmys. He is an incredibly respected investigative journalist. He does not fuck around. He does not take fools lightly. He does not suffer stupid stories. And he believes very solidly in Bob Lazar. And he's talked to him over the years many times. And again, he's featured in this documentary. He works with this Jeremy Corbell guy very closely throughout the course of the documentary. But getting back to Bob Lazar's original claims and everything. So basically it's this. Bob Lazar, when he came out on these reports, claimed that he had been hired to work at S4 from Los Alamos Research Lab in New Mexico, which works on, top clearance, high level stuff, a lot of technology, a lot of, cutting edge technology. He had worked there and then was hired from there through a separate company to work at S4. Now, the first rub in Bob Lazar's story comes right there, because George Knapp, being the boots-on-the-ground investigative reporter that he is, contacted Los Alamos Research Lab many, many times. And they always said, we have no record of this dude. He did not work here. There's no Robert Lazar. I'm sorry, Mr. Emmy. And George Knapp, again, the boots-on-the-ground man, found a phone book, a Los Alamos Research Lab phone book from the time that Lazar said he worked there, with Robert Lazar's name in it and a phone number. He was on the books at the Los Alamos Research Lab. And there was another story in a newspaper about him that talked about him working there. But the main thing, the real smoking gun there, is the name in the phone book. It's undeniable. Now, one person, Stanton Friedman, who we've talked about on the show before, he's the godfather of Roswell, the flying saucer ufologist, and we'll certainly talk about him in the Roswell episode, but he does not believe a word of Bob Lazar. And he says that the phone book even is misleading, because it suggests that Bob Lazar wasn't exactly working for Los Alamos. He was working for like a division of it. But in the end, as far as what most other people say that at least entertain the idea of the Bob Lazar story being true, that's just kind of like splitting hairs, basically. He worked there. He worked at Los Alamos. Now, what really discredited him in many people's eyes was that he said he went to MIT and Caltech. In those schools, they could not find any records of him. There were no phone books. There was nothing. George Knapp interviewed many people that said that they knew he went there, and they had seen him there and stuff, but there was no transcripts or anything that, physical evidence that he went to these two schools. And in the documentary, prior to the documentary, back in the first days that he came out, he's been asked many times, where's the proof of these schools that you say he went to? And his answer is, I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what has been done with them. All I can tell you is, do you really think that I got hired at Los Alamos Research Lab out of high school? And that's kind of where you have to take it. And there's a part in the documentary where he's talking, and when I speak of the documentary, I mean he's talking now in 2018 to this director guy. He says, look, you can get caught up in that minutia of researching where I went to school. It's proven that I worked at Los Alamos, that it's been proven and corroborated by other people that worked there that I had high security clearance. Excuse me. Because George Knapp did find other people eventually after the phone book too that had worked there and said, yes, he worked on top secret projects, and he had, I think, Q level access is what it was called. So Bob Lazar basically says, look, you can get caught up in all this shit, and you can research it, and feel free to do so, but you're missing the bigger picture of what I'm talking about, which is the alien technology that we supposedly have possession of with the government. Now, there's a couple of ways you can look at that. You can say, well, he's just, again, he's gliding over the fact that he didn't really go to these schools, and so, that discredits him, and you shouldn't believe anything he says. Or you can say, well, he's right. It doesn't really matter. I mean, you could sit there and look at, did he go to the school? But George Knapp says in the documentary, if, let's say we produce transcripts, we finally get a hold of him, and there he is with, transcripts from both these schools. All that proves is that he went to school. That's all that proves. It does not prove that he worked at S4, that he worked on alien technology, that he dismantled alien gravitational systems to figure out how they maneuvered through space, that he did not work with the controversial element 115. Doesn't prove any of that, just proves that he was in class. My personal, and this is just me, I tend to think that there is some exaggeration in Bob Lazar's talking about his going to MIT and Caltech. I think maybe he did maybe go there. Didn't graduate necessarily. But you might ask, well, how would he get hired for Los Alamos lab to work on these top secret projects, physics? Bob Lazar is a guy who all by himself has invented jet-powered cars, jet-powered bikes, little like ATV jet-powered things, all on his own. Today, he works for a company, or I think he owns a company called United Nuclear, where they make all this weird shit, weird chemicals and I mean, I'm not a scientist and stuff, but they smash atoms and stuff like that, and they do all this crazy stuff because despite his education or lack thereof, he is clearly a knowledgeable, extremely intelligent man who knows a fuck of a lot about science. When he got hired to work at S4, he had sent his resume out to a lot of places, and eventually some interest came back from this company that turned out to be the company that was going to send him to S4. But when he started working there, even he thought it was weird that he got hired for something with this level of clearance, majestic clearance, possibly in reference to the Majestic 12, which is a whole nother episode of its own and will be told. But majestic clearance, meaning very high, obviously, because he's going to, see fucking alien ships and stuff. But he thought it was weird. He thought it was weird that a guy who's sort of this higher level scientist, but certainly not like upper echelon. He's not like the top of the heap or anything like that. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of scientists more qualified than him that they easily could have gotten to work on projects like this. But they chose him. And sort of the basic collective, agreement on why this may have happened is that he was a crazy outside the box thinker. I mean, again, the guy's like building fucking jet cars and stuff like that in his backyard. He's got a particle accelerator in his living room, things like that. So you hire a guy like that because the project apparently that they were working on, trying to reverse engineer this craft and figure out what propelled it, why it was able to, travel so far through space in such a short time, get some nutcases that, know about science, but think all, outside the box. Also, to the government's convenience, they can be easily discredited. Much like Edward Snowden, that was a guy who also turned out to be a whistleblower who did not have the background that you could point to and say, well, yeah, you should believe Edward Snowden because look at all the experience and all the things he's done. He didn't have a lot. He was this kind of mad scientist dude who figured out all this shit about surveillance and then told everybody, and has been discredited many times and humiliated by the fact that, well, what's his education? What's his background? Nothing. He's just this moron. Don't believe him. Same thing with Bob Lazar. So anyway, Bob Lazar gets hired to look at this stuff. And basically, he's first of all, the story has been told that Bob Lazar saw aliens walking around Area 51. He didn't. He says that very clearly in the documentary, and he said that in the past. He was shown briefings that contained information about the pilots of these crafts, and those were gray aliens from the Zeta Reticuli system. He also saw some other weird stuff that he just kind of glanced at because he was given these briefing papers and told to, you got to look at this stuff really quickly. This is the technical stuff about what we've already found out about these, these gravity propulsion systems. And so just, get through that as quickly as you can. And the pilots and stuff are in there, the kids. That's what they call the gray aliens, the kids. Learn about the kids. But apparently he also saw some other stuff like there was some weird time travel experiment the government was doing called Looking Glass. He doesn't talk about that in the documentary, but I remember that from reading about him before. But again, it was something he just kind of glanced at, and it apparently, you can correct me if I'm wrong, or just know that I'm wrong when you're listening to this. Apparently the Looking Glass program was something where you could look, a very short amount into the future, or maybe the past, or both. But, it wasn't like time travel. It wasn't sending people Back to the Future style to the 50s and stuff like that. It was just like this thing where you could kind of look ahead in time or back in time. Anyway, that's not really fucking important to the story at all. So anyway, Lazar is looking through all these briefings. He sees the stuff about aliens, and then he gets to work on these crafts. And the one that he worked on was a fully operational flying saucer, classic flying saucer. The kind you see in the comic books and the movies, just a straight up flying saucer. And the way he describes the propulsion system that they were working on is that basically they were using gravity, they were creating gravity and manipulating gravity. He's saying that current science, we don't even really fully, completely still understand gravity, let alone can we manipulate it. So he describes the way that these ships would fly through space. Instead of propulsion in the way we think of it, where you shoot something out of the back and that propels the thing forward, instead of that, it would manipulate gravity. So if you imagine, this is his example, putting a bowling ball in the middle of your bed, and then about a foot in front of that, pushing down on the bed, the bowling ball rolls forward. So that's kind of what they're doing with gravity. They're manipulating it so that they're moving forward and being pulled rather than propelled. And so they were trying to reverse engineer these things, dismantling them and trying to figure out how exactly the extraterrestrials did this. I want to play you a clip from the documentary where Bob Lazar is actually talking about the spacecraft itself, how it actually worked, what it looked like, the propulsion system, the gravity. This is just a short clip that I'm going to play you from a very longer segment within the documentary. And also, while he's talking in this clip you're going to hear, he was actually drawing the spaceship and everything. And what caught my eye was how drawing it was very scientific for him. He wasn't drawing like a doodle or like a comic book picture. He was drawing schematics, and he was drawing it as a diagram very scientifically while he was explaining this. And it made me think that, even if Bob Lazar is completely full of shit, he is not stupid. He's not ignorant of science. He knows, he understands physics to some level, far beyond what I do, far beyond what a lot of us do. And the way he describes this is just fascinating to me. So again, this is from a much longer segment, and he's drawing the whole time he's talking, but just let's listen to how he describes this.
So it's the reactor here powering the gravity amplifiers. Gravity amplifiers output goes into the gravity emitters at the bottom, and the resulting gravity beam or anti-gravity wave can be pretty much put anywhere you want to. There was another level up here. Now I had access and was permitted to view and look at the operation of this main level with the gravity amplifiers and the level below the gravity emitters. There is a level above which consisted of these two areas that I'm not all that familiar with. I assume these to be some sort of navigational engine. That's what I assume to be up there. I don't know for a fact. Again, that was not part of my job, and I was only led to believe that. The center antenna is really an extension of the reactor in the center, and that's a waveguide.
Now, when Bob Lazar started to sort of trickle out the information that this was going on, was apparently, this is not covered in the documentary, but this is facts of the time when this happened. He confided a lot in a guy named John Lear, not to be confused with the Lear jet. Actually, it should absolutely to be confused with the Lear jet. His dad, John Lear's dad, was the inventor of the Lear aircraft. And John Lear himself, this friend of Bob Lazar's, had flown, I think, almost every single aircraft known to man back in the, by the time that the 90s rolled around. He had been an ace pilot since the time he was 17, galloping around the skies, logging over 16,000 miles, winning awards, getting literally every available flight certificate that you could possibly get. And also a genius of aviation, that he had over 100 patents on different types of equipment for aircraft. So he's a very smart guy. Also a lunatic. He described his friendship with Bob Lazar in an exaggerated fashion, to say the least, because he told people that Bob Lazar told him that there was a base on the moon, and that there was a base on Mars, which later on Bob Lazar said he had no knowledge of such. Once again, he did not walk around talking with aliens and like hanging out in the cafeteria with aliens talking about where their bases are and stuff. John Lear believes that there are bases on the moon and bases on Mars, and maybe that's true, but that's a whole different story. It would explain something to Steph Curry, though. Steph Curry, just as a side note, mentioned this on the last podcast. Steph Curry, greatest shooter of all time, point guard for the Golden State Warriors, 2-time MVP, 3-time champion, apparently doesn't believe that we landed on the moon. And if there's a why in that, excuse my throat. It's flaring up a little bit. But I had to do this podcast, so please just deal with it. Just go along with me. Let's tough it out. Steph Curry not believing that we went to the moon, and also questioning if we went to the moon, which this is a question a lot of people have. If we did go to the moon all the time, how come we've never gone back? If John Lear is correct, there's another guy named Richard Hoagland who believes seriously in bases on the moon. If those guys are correct, we were told not to go back to the moon. We were fucking told not to go back to the moon. Interestingly, the Chinese are launching some sort of probe to the dark side of the moon coming up pretty soon. So we'll see what happens with that. May start a galactic war. Or they'll find Pink Floyd. You'll see you on the dark side of the moon. Okay. Enough of that shit. Anyway, so John Lear is thankfully not featured in the 2018 documentary, but he is an important figure in the Bob Lazar story because one of the things Bob Lazar told him as he started to leak out information that suggested that maybe he really did work at S4 was he said, this is when they do the test flights. When they shoot these aircrafts, these spaceships, these alien extraterrestrial spaceships into the sky. They do it at Wednesday night around 5:36, right when the sun goes down, because that's when there's the least traffic on the highway. So sure enough, they go there, and they actually videotape this. You can find it on YouTube. They go to public land near Area 51, and they look up at Groom Lake, Papoose Lake, which are within the area of Area 51 and S4. And sure enough, there's a goddamn flying saucer floating around. Like, it's all grainy footage from the 80s and stuff, but other investigators, once this happened, started flocking to this place. And, as well as just sightseers and people who wanted a good show in the sky. And they all saw these things. And there are some pictures that are really fantastic in pre-Photoshop days of literally like a flying saucer flying above Area 51. Now, the government obviously got sick of these fucking looky-loos hanging out around their facility, looking up at their test flights of alien craft or whatever that they were supposedly flying up there. Certainly, judging by the pictures, a few of them were goddamn flying saucers. So man-made or alien-made, they were flying saucers. Which, incidentally, side note again, Bob Lazar said when he first went into S4, when he saw the craft initially, before he had read the briefings, he thought, oh, this is why people think flying saucers are real, because the government's working on this crazy ship. Little did he know just yet that it actually wasn't a crazy ship that they came up with. It was, in fact, a UFO or extraterrestrial spacecraft, according to him. But anyway, the government got sick of these, window shopper people looking at their UFOs flying around all the time, so they started to expand their land grabbing around Area 51 to push out the areas of public land so that you would be further and further away from actual Area 51 to be able to get into position to see these flights. To the point where today, if you want to actually get up high enough to where you might be able to spot some of this crazy stuff, you have to hike up a mountain, which only an experienced climber can do. I mean, if a fat fuck like me tried to climb up this mountain to see the UFOs, I would roll to my death. After 1/3 of the climb, I would just tumble down like a roly-poly fucking fat ball and to my demise. So needless to say, there's a lot less people that are hanging out watching the spectacle in the sky above Area 51 anymore. Also, it should be mentioned that Area 51 was not actually publicly acknowledged until 2013. 2013 is when the U.S. government finally acknowledged that they had a military base near Groom Lake in Nevada. And they, of course, they downplayed it. It's just, we worked on the ox cart and the U-2 spy plane there, and that's all it really was. It's not that big of a deal. It's a fucking big deal. That place is gigantic, and they constantly expand it. There's even a baseball field at Area 51. It's true. If you look at like Google Maps, aerial photographs of Area 51, there's a baseball field there, so that the workers can relax and play baseball before their flesh is burned off by the toxic chemicals that they burn at Area 51. There was a big lawsuit about that some years back. A lot of the employees were getting sick and dying, and their skin was falling off like some sort of horror movie. I think the government at that point was still not acknowledging that Area 51 was an actual facility. So, these people weren't winning the lawsuit, but a whole lot goes into that. If you want to hear more about that, I have an Area 51 specific podcast that you can find on our YouTube channel, or I think it's still on iTunes as well, where I get into the whole details of the man-eating radioactive material that tore these poor people to the smithereens. But yeah, so there's a baseball field there. What they have not acknowledged, the government, is S4, which again is where the alien ships are researched. And S4 is not Area 51. It is a mountain. It is built within a mountain near Area 51, near Papoose Lake, where supposedly, like according to Bob Lazar and some others who have come forward since anonymously, mainly to George Knapp, where there are 9 hangars that are sort of camouflaged into the mountain so that you can't, just walk by and see open hangars with spaceships. But again, it's not like really close to Area 51. It's a few miles away. So you can't, if you work at Area 51, you can't just like go take a cigarette break and go look at the ships. It doesn't work like that. However, even though the government only acknowledged Area 51 in 2013 and did not acknowledge S4, George Knapp actually got a government representative at one point to admit that there was a testing facility called S4 in Nevada. Whether the dude slipped up or, whether George Knapp is just so fucking convincing and so influential in the way he talks to people that he can just pull that information out of you and just give like a human truth serum, make you just pump you until you give up. I don't know. Either way, George Knapp has said that it's been confirmed to him that there is a facility called S4. So we know Area 51 exists. We know S4 exists. Are there spaceships in S4 that Bob Lazar worked on? Well, let's talk about a couple of the things that he claimed back in the day that have come to fruition as we look at things today. The first is, and this is my favorite part of the documentary, the director is at Bob Lazar's house, and he's talking to him, and he's saying, hey, look, way back when you used to describe the hand scanners that were used at S4, and what you described was something that did not exist anywhere. It was like a hand scanner, but you put your hand into it, right? There was like these lines, that you would put between each finger, would go between each finger, and then a light from above would shine above your hand, and it would measure like your bone density or the bone size of your fingers, because those are unique to every individual. And nobody believed him. They're like, whatever, dude. You didn't just use your badge. And he's like, no, it was high tech. We had to use these things. Well, this director of this documentary found that Nellis testing facility, also in Nevada, nearby Area 51, had released pictures just like a couple of years ago of these scanners, exactly as Bob Lazar had described years and years and years ago. So in the documentary, he's sitting in Bob Lazar's house, and he shows him these pictures. And Bob Lazar's reaction to these pictures goes back to what I talked about earlier about when you could tell how scared he was when he started talking about, being on camera so that if anything happened to him, people would know that he was right. The reaction that he has when he sees these pictures, it's not of amazement of like, oh, wow, I made this up and now there's something like it. It's this feeling of this vindication of, God, finally, something comes out that I've been telling you people about this for 30 years. And finally, we see these, and he's very happy about it. And he says, I never thought I'd see one of these things again. That's exactly what we used. He said the one we used was a little more primitive than this, but basically it's the same exact thing. And the director says, do you ever feel, do you feel good when you see things like this? A little bit of a vindication. And Bob Lazar says, yeah, this is a pretty big one, because this is one that people thought I made up. And, yeah, there's nice little moments like this of I told you so's that, they make me feel a little bit better, because Bob Lazar, as portrayed in this documentary, is a guy who he doesn't want to talk about UFOs. He's not on interviews all the time. The director had a lot of trouble just getting him to talk about all this stuff again. He just wants to make his jet cars and make his weird nuclear stuff at his United Nuclear Company. He's never made money off of this UFO thing. I mean, he's never, there's never been a book. There's never been a movie. I mean, this is a documentary, but I mean, he's not getting paid for this, or if he is, it's like a fucking stipend lunch or whatever. He's not getting like paid big bucks. This is like very, very low budget documentary, except for the Mickey Rourke thing. Again, Mickey Rourke pops up every 10 minutes or so in this movie, just ranting and raving like Dennis Hopper in Apocalypse Now for no reason. But anyway, Bob Lazar clearly feels some vindication, and you can tell how honest. He's not surprised to see these pictures. He's not like, oh my God, I made it up, and now look at that. It looks just like the thing I made up. He's like, oh, fucking A, finally, something comes out that I tried to tell people about. The other big thing about that is the very controversial topic of Element 115. Element 115 was apparently the element that was used in propelling, or, the propulsion systems of these UFOs, these alien spacecrafts, back when Bob Lazar was working on it. And it was called Element 115 internally at S4. There was no such element, on the periodic table as Element 115. This is just what they called it. And they tried to synthesize it, and they tried to, recreate it. It was part of the whole operation of trying to back engineer these things, was that if we can recreate this element, then we can do this, we can do that, and we can figure out the technology. But Element 115, if you talk to a scientist, he said, hey, Bob Lazar says there's Element 115. They'd say, Element 115, get the fuck out of here. There's no Element 115. If you look at a periodic table of the elements in 2018, you'll notice that there's an Element 115 on it now. It's very controversial. A lot of people say, well, it's not what he was talking about. It's different. It's a different thing that we were able to synthesize. That shit that he made up, you could never synthesize that. Well, whatever it is or was, there it is on the periodic table as it stands today. This whatever gravity, anti-gravity, matter to antimatter propulsion system that these aliens are using is, we still haven't obviously figured it out, or we'd be fucking using it. We go to war, and what do you see? You see the same shit. There's better tanks, and there's better airplanes, and there's, now we got drones, which I'm sure they make a lot of drones at Area 51. But drones are the big thing. If we had been able yet to figure out this anti-gravity, antimatter, matter thing, I'm sure we'd be using some of that shit, right? In our wars. Maybe save a couple of fucking lives of guys on the ground. If we can rip space and time. So you could ask the question from that. You could say, well, if they haven't figured it out yet, maybe it's because they never were working on that to begin with, because Bob Lazar made it up. Maybe. But we do have Element 115 now. And back in the day, Element 115 was bullshit. That's what they called it. Called it bullshit. And yet, here it is now. Is it the exact same thing? Some say, yeah, it is actually basically what he described. Some others say, no, it's not. It has nothing to do with it. It's a new element, but we called it Element 115 because of the way the chart works, and Bob Lazar can go fuck himself. I mean, even now, if you go to Wikipedia and you look at Element 115, it talks about the real Element 115 that's on the periodic table, and then it's there's one of those, if you know Wikipedia, there's one of those links at the top, which says, this is about the real element 115. If you're looking for the fictional element 115, click here. And then it goes to like a page about science fiction. And I think Bob Lazar is mentioned in there or something. So again, whether the element 115 that he was talking about versus what's on the periodic table are the same thing, that's up for debate. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to come down on it one way or another. But, and this is covered in the documentary as well, Bob Lazar was said to have stolen some of element 115 from S4. One of the guys who made this claim was John Lear, who openly said that, quote, we stole element 115. Crazy John Lear. Bob Lazar has not admitted to that. Now, there is a part in the movie that gets very interesting where the director takes Bob Lazar out to like the woods to ask him about stealing element 115. And he says, I'm going to ask you about it. I'm going to put your answer on these secure hard drives. And then, when we make this whole thing, you can decide whether or not we want to put this in. And if so, how much, how we want to present it. And then they don't show Bob Lazar answering it because I don't think he does. It's a little bit cloudy and it's not real well done in the documentary at that point because they kind of just show the tape fast forwarding. But the next day, apparently Bob Lazar's United Nuclear company is raided by the FBI and other unnamed agencies. And there's a sequence in the movie of Bob Lazar texting the director saying, I'm being raided right now. There's a ton of people here. He texts him some pictures of like, there's a girl with an FBI shirt on, and then there's like a ton of other people inside and outside of his United Nuclear place. Their story, when Bob Lazar explains it after, is that they were just looking for an order form because they suspected that somebody had ordered some weird material from his United Nuclear that might be used for nefarious purposes, so they needed to find the fucking receipt or whatever. Now, Bob Lazar and the director and George Knapp think they're looking for element 115. And apparently that conversation that Bob Lazar and the director had that was going to go on the secure hard drives and, wasn't going to be shown in the movie unless he wanted to, was referenced by one of the people from one of the agencies in the United Nuclear raid that day. And I'm thinking, as I watch this, and I'm still thinking, like, is that drummed up somehow? Did Bob Lazar just have a bunch of fucking people come into his nuclear place and have a couple of them have FBI shirts on and just, say that he was raided for the sake of drama because the guy asked him if he stole the element 115? Well, the guy asks George Knapp, he says, look, this is what he says. He says he got raided. Today, right after we did this conversation about element 115. And George Knapp says, I'm not surprised. This type of thing has happened before. He starts to talk more. Things like that tend to happen. And again, Bob Lazar does not talk about this very often at all. Doesn't make any money off it. Like I said, no books, no movies, nothing. So I tend to believe, based on what you see in the movie, and, I always take George Knapp is such a touchstone of credibility throughout this entire movie that's like when he jumps in and weighs in on something like that, I kind of think, oh, okay, all right, I'll buy that then. It's not out of the realm of possibility at all that Bob Lazar starts talking element 115 and all of a sudden some people pay him a visit at his United Nuclear facility. So the follow-up, the next day or so or whatever, that the director interviews Bob Lazar again, he says, hey, look, I'm just going to ask you, did you take element 115? Did you steal any? Bob Lazar won't answer. So I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm not going to talk about that. Which is obviously not a no. It's not necessarily a yes, but it's not a no. And Bob Lazar has claimed through the years that there is something that he has that is absolute physical proof that he could produce that would show that he worked at S4, but basically it would cost him his life. That I suspect, me and others, but me suspect that would probably be stolen element 115 either of the science fictional variety or the stuff that's on the periodic table, or maybe they are one and the same. So as Bob Lazar is talking about all these things, and again, this is him talking now, he is telling the stories the same way he told them 30 years ago. There is no embellishment. There is no extra stuff. There's no, oh, by the way, and this happened also. There's none of that. And he talks about it in a way that is very sort of like, I don't really want to get into this, but I will. He gets pissed off when the guy starts talking about the education thing. Bob Lazar is kind of like, look, like I said earlier, it's like you get bogged down in all this minutia and you can go fucking research this or that, or you can, look at what I've been saying. And then you see things like the hand scanners and stuff like that. The admission of S4. I mean, look, Area 51 was not even like a thing until Bob Lazar showed up. It wasn't on the map, quote unquote, no pun intended. I mean, it wasn't on the map literally, but it wasn't on the map of the public consciousness either. It wasn't a thing. Now in Independence Day, that's like the base that they go to. It's Area 51. And they basically, Independence Day kind of takes the whole Bob Lazar story and inserts it into their movie, where they have like the wreckage from a crash in the 40s and they've reverse engineered it and they know how it works and everything. No credit given to Bob Lazar, but that's the urban myth, and it is inserted into Independence Day. And there's plenty of other movies that talk about Area 51 and stuff, and use it as the sort of de facto military secret base that has aliens on it. But Bob Lazar was the guy that kind of brought that into being. He was the guy who they showed the videotape of him and crazy John Lear looking at the UFO, and then all of a sudden, all the looky-loos start showing up in their campers, chomping on hot dogs, watching UFOs fly through the air, having a good old time. And the government pushes them out to the point where roll down a mountain and die if you even want to try and see Area 51 flying saucers. By the way, there's actually been additional, just this year in 2018, there were some proposals for additional land grabs in that area that I don't know how that's turned out yet. I read a story, it was in January, and I just looked it up before this podcast, and I don't know that that's a resolution has happened with that, but there was a proposal to grab a little more land, make it a little harder for even for the experienced mountain climbers. So now you basically have to be fucking Evel Knievel to get up high enough to see the flying saucers above Area 51. Which of course is just a U-2 spy plane. That's all they built this thing for, right? Please. Getting back to Bob Lazar and at the way he talks today, his mom is interviewed and talks about everything that he told her about Area 51. Same stuff that we've heard. His wife, 17 years, is, sticking by him saying, look, this is what happened to him. This is what he saw. He's told me the same thing. He's not a guy that makes shit up. He's not a liar. He just wants to quietly make his jet cars and stuff. And when he does, with great reticence, come forward to talk about these UFOs, it's always the same story. And George Knapp talks about that a lot, about how he believes Bob Lazar because of the fact that over the years, his story just doesn't change. And he doesn't seek attention, fame from it. He doesn't do lectures. He doesn't try to portray himself as this master scientist who worked on UFOs, but he talks about it. He talks about at the very end, the director kind of says, what is the message that you want people to take from your experience? And he says, mainly, I said this before, but holding back the knowledge that we have material from extraterrestrials and that we know that they exist is criminal. And again, that, the scientific community is being denied the knowledge of the fact that we have technology that literally shouldn't exist and hasn't existed and doesn't exist anywhere outside of these craft and in these labs in S4 where they work on this stuff. And he's very serious about those two sort of crystallizations of everything that he's been through. It's just like those two things. He's just want you to understand that these things exist. I'm not worried about cares if I fucking went to MIT or whatever? Just forget about all that stuff. Forget about alien autopsies and things like that. Just, it's these two things. It's that extraterrestrials exist. They won't tell us. And that there's this incredible science that we're in possession of, and they won't tell us. And when I saw him talk about that, I came to a conclusion. And I don't, again, like one of the things I say on this podcast all the time, if you listen to it regularly, I always say that I don't really put my opinion forth. And that's usually because my opinion in almost every case of these UFO stories is, I don't know. I try to present both sides of the story. And when you do that, and if you honestly look at both sides of the story, in many cases, it's hard to come to a conclusion. And this is one of them. It's easy to get into a bunch of debunking of Bob Lazar, especially if you start with the schooling stuff. It's also easy to get into the side of supporting him by saying, look, the hand scanners, the element 115 is probably the element 115 that he worked on. It's just that they're not going to admit it because that would be admitting the thing, They never admitted that there was Area 51, but he knew about it. He knew when the ships flew. You can go both ways on it, right? But in my opinion, this has always kind of been my opinion, but in seeing this documentary, it solidified it. I think that Bob Lazar worked at S4, worked on some sort of crazy-ass gravitational propulsion system, worked on back engineering some sort of technology, be it alien or something that we discovered in space or somewhere in some crazy archaeologist finding on Earth. Who knows? Who knows where it came from? He's often asked too. They say, where did they ever tell you how we got a hold of these ships? And he always says they didn't. No one ever told me. That wasn't part of my job. They didn't need me to know that. They just wanted me to work on it. But I believe he worked in the Nevada desert. I believe he worked in a facility called S4, and I believed he worked on the kind of stuff that he says he worked on. Whether or not it was extraterrestrial, that part I'll leave up in the air, and you can think about that. I don't think he's just making some shit up. I don't think he was throwing frisbees during the time that he said that he worked at S4, and then just decided to make up this cockamamie story because he never did anything with it. He never took it any further than what he said. He just came out and said, "This is what's going on. This is what I did. Please look at my face on camera so that if I get killed, everyone will know that I was telling the truth. And now I just want to go make jet cars." And then, he says in the documentary that talking about this stuff really made his life worse. Didn't help him. He's despised by many people in the UFO community, certainly in the scientific community. And I'm very grateful to this dude for making this documentary because stories like this, stories like Bob Lazar, the longer time goes by without any developments in the story that are in the public eye, the hand scanners, the hand scanner thing, that would have flown under the radar had it not been for this documentary. Nobody would have said, "Oh, hey, look, the hand scanners that Bob Lazar talked about, where that turns out he was telling the truth the whole time." That wouldn't have happened. It would have just flown under the radar, and the waters of time would have continued to run on until the Bob Lazar myth becomes just that. Some crazy guy in the 80s who came out and said that he saw aliens at Area 51. You look at JFK, it's the same thing. It's like so much time has gone by that everyone at this point kind of just accepts, it's probably just Lee Harvey Oswald. The craze is over. The books aren't coming out anymore. There's not, you're not seeing a whole lot of crazy documentaries about who killed Kennedy and stuff. People don't fucking care anymore. And it's the Area 51 thing was becoming the same. So it was just becoming accepted that, well, the government says that it exists now, and they say they made the U-2 spy plane there and the SR-71, which they did. So let's just leave it. Whatever. They don't think about the fact that, the government admits it now. In 2013, they admitted that the thing had been around for 60 years before they admitted it. But that just goes by the wayside. Whatever, at least they admitted it. It's the same thing with Roswell. Like their final excuse decades and decades later was, well, it wasn't a weather balloon. It was a radar detecting balloon. Okay. And then everyone's like, radar detecting balloon. Let's move on. And I'm very glad that this documentary came out to revisit what he said, revisit some of the developments that have happened in the time since he first came out, and give you, me, the viewer, the experience of getting to actually kind of just see this guy as he is, see the way he talks about these things, and see how fucking smart he clearly is. You know, whether he's an MIT graduate or whatever, the dude is brilliant. There's also a very interesting thing in the documentary, which people have used to discredit Bob Lazar, but George Knapp points out why it actually works in his favor, which is that apparently sometime after his whole coming out and talking about UFOs, he got busted for helping out some hookers who were making a brothel, and he was charged, like they threw the book at him. And when they were doing his background research, like they couldn't find anything, just like George Knapp. They're just running into all these, like, he's a ghost, he doesn't exist type of thing. So they wanted him to fess up and say he never worked at S4. They wanted him to come clean and just kind of portray himself as this sort of low-life scumbag who works with hookers. And he wouldn't do it. He told them, this is where I worked at S4, I did this, I did that. And they said, you know, basically it was like a question of, in trying to scare him, the prosecution was like, dude, if you don't just fucking admit that you didn't work with these stupid aliens, we'll just let you off. But if you keep sticking to the story, you're going to do hard time in prison. He stuck to his guns. Thankfully, he had a good defense, and he did not do hard time in prison. He got probation and something else, parole, something like that. But even in the face of the threat that he might go to fucking prison for not just saying, all right, fine, I didn't work with the aliens, he didn't do it. Stuck to his guns. And seeing this documentary, I have come to the conclusion that I believe this guy, at least to varying extents. You know, whether or not there's a big spaceship from Roswell or whatever that's sitting in there that they definitely know is extraterrestrial, I don't know. But the way he describes it, and he got to see the inside, and he said it's got the seats were tiny, like for kids, which is, again, like the nickname that floated around S4 as to the Greys. It was the kids. And again, he didn't see any Greys, but the briefing showed Greys. So there was they knew of the existence of Greys, and if these ships were from extraterrestrials, they were Greys. Because, in my opinion, if there are aliens, those are the only ones. Not interested in your fucking reptilians. I'm just not. We're not going to talk reptilians on Pop Talking Aliens. Might as well be called Pop Talking Greys. That's what we acknowledge around here. Maybe we'll do a show about the reptilians and stuff at some point, I guess. It's somewhat interesting. And speaking of interesting, Bob Lazar is a man that should at least be reconsidered, reevaluated by you, by the UFO community, by anyone who's interested in this stuff, because there's more to this guy than just popping up in 1989 and spinning a bunch of yarns about UFOs and reverse engineering technology and Area 51 and secret mountain hangars with spaceships in them. There's more to it. There's more to this guy, and there's something about him that pleads you to reconsider the idea that he has credibility. And so I had to talk about that. And if this was a somewhat unstructured, meandering podcast, I apologize for that, but I had to get this out. The next one, it'll be all slick, Roswell, the whole thing. It's going to be great. We'll have the sound bites. We'll have all that stuff. One other thing I do want to say before we go out is that, and my last point about why I kind of believe Bob Lazar is that he didn't make a deathbed confession. He didn't sign an affidavit only to be opened upon his death. He did this when he was a young man. You know, he had obviously this brilliant scientific mind. There's a ton of things he could have done with his life. But instead he comes out with this, he comes and tells this UFO story. And it affects his whole life, mainly negatively, as he said. He's not the wheezy guy who comes out. If you're familiar with the wheezy guy, he is a guy who is this old man who's probably long since dead, but a few years ago he popped up and talked to some Richard Dolan, a UFO investigator, and he talked about how he had been to Area 51 and he'd seen the aliens and he'd seen this and he'd seen all this. And like this, there's no consequence for this guy because he's going to die probably before that interview's over. You want to hear a second of him? You want to hear a second of the wheezy guy? All right.
Could they tell what the source of power was of this craft?
Yeah, it was like a reverse gravitational thing of some kind. In fact, one later on, I got the mathematical code for reversing gravity in a 3x5 card. I guess there are different types of grays and so on.
How did you see that evidence?
Well, at the later on at S4, we viewed the autopsy film, and then the colonel said, "What we've got in here is we're interviewing a gray alien."
A 3x5 card. A 3x5 card. I played you a minute of Bob Lazar talking about how this thing worked. That was 1 minute. That scene goes on for like 5 minutes. And he still doesn't even like understand a lot of it. You know, he was only worked on it for a certain amount of time. It was mysterious to all of them. There's this element 115. There's all this stuff going on. This fucking guy wheezing out that he's got a 3x5 card? They just scribbled it down. We got it. Here you go. If this technology, and he doesn't even know what I love Wheezy Guy, but he drives me nuts because I feel like he is a fountain of disinformation. But here is the thing. Here is the I am your father moment of this episode of Pop Talking Aliens. I just found this out when I was grabbing the clip of Wheezy Guy for this particular episode. The Wheezy Guy interview was produced and directed by the same guy who did this Bob Lazar movie, Jeremy Corbell. I had no idea. Apparently, it was supposed to be part of a bigger movie called Truth Embargo, but it ended up just being this 15-minute interview with Wheezy Guy. And you can find the whole thing on Vimeo, and then you can find just the interview on YouTube, which is where I always pull it from. But I can only imagine that the reason this movie did not become feature length was probably because Wheezy Guy's credibility there's nowhere to verify it or in any way make the case that this guy knows anything that he's talking about or that he's not just completely making this shit up, especially with his long pauses between every answer he has. So Jeremy Corbell was working on Wheezy Guy. So we are covering 2 of his masterpieces on this episode. And I was kind of astounded to find that out because the Bob Lazar documentary, aside from the Mickey Rourke stuff, is so well done that I watched like an interview with this guy who made the movie and everything. I'm very impressed with his enthusiasm for UFOs, with his knowledge, with his sort of being on the fence about things, not being completely committed to one answer or another. And so the fact that he had Wheezy Guy and interviewed him with any sort of credibility was kind of beyond me. But then again, I look at the fact that this quote-unquote movie turned out into a 15-minute interview is encouraging to me because I think he kind of just decided that credibility was not going hand in hand with that particular documentary, so he ditched it, obviously. 3x5 card. Oh. Wheezy Guy is going to be back in the next episode of Pop Talking Aliens because he talks about actually touching the Roswell UFO. Of course he did. Of course he touched it. I'm sure he probably talked to the aliens too. And Wheezy Guy did everything. It's like one of those, it's like a comedy sketch where you talk to a guy who's gone back in time and somehow not only did he go back in time, but he witnessed every single event. Or it's like the old Mel Brooks thing where he's 2,000 years old and he met every single historical figure over the course of 2,000 years. It's like this guy. I work for the CIA, and I was in on every single major UFO event from 1947 to 1995 or whatever. Anyway, that is Wheezy Guy for you. brought to you, as was this Bob Lazar documentary, by Jeremy Corbell, who is one of my favorite human beings on earth at this point. Again, the documentary is called Bob Lazar, Area 51 and UFOs. The Mickey Rourke shit is fascinating. It's completely meaningless and unnecessary in the movie and nonsensical. But if you want to watch the movie high, I guess it's probably pretty cool. It's probably the best part of the movie in that case. But again, it's $15. You got to buy it. You can't rent it. You can't watch it on Prime. But if you're into this stuff and you want to kind of get an encapsulation of Bob Lazar, I definitely recommend checking it out if you have the means. So until then, until the Roswell episode, which I will greet you with mid-month, next month in January, and I will talk to you on the other side of Roswell in a few weeks. Until then, cue the hot chick.
Pop Talk and Aliens, the William Clear Podcast.